Well, we all agree that we need a good immigration system, and Canada's been described the last several years as a policy dumpster fire. So, what do we mean by that? What are the facts, and how do we get our immigration system back on track? So, we know that immigration is vital for our economy, out of humanitarian reasons as well, to build this country. And so, I'm delighted to join a conversation with our friend Riley Donovan. And Riley is a freelance journalist. He's also a researcher, particularly in the field of immigration. And he's the founder of the Dominion Review. A warm welcome, Riley.
Well, thank you for having me on, David.
Well, it's great to see you, my friend, because Riley, I would say that the immigration policy file is one of those, how do we call them, an elephant in the room, one that often, for a variety of reasons, Canadians don't particularly like to talk about, but we sure are talking about it today in our nation. And, the facts are pretty stunning. In 2024 alone, if memory serves me, we've had, in total 2.1 million, immigrants come into the country. In fact, Stats Canada says that 8% of our entire population today are, people who don't even have full citizen status, and that compares to a historic range of, say, 2 to 3% the last many years. So in a Leger poll, and this is not quite as recent, but August 2024 indicated that some 65% of Canadians felt current immigration levels were too high, and this is across every region of the country and every demographic, including male and female. This portfolio has seemed like it's shaken the country in a big way. Would you agree with that kind of overarching statement?
Yeah, I would absolutely. What you have seen is that for decades, I would say that the problems with immigration are very deeply rooted, and they go stretch back all the way back to the early '90s, and even earlier, in fact. But what you really saw in recent times, particularly since the pandemic, was this outpouring of concern and anger and frustration on the part of the Canadian public. Um, and this stemmed directly from the fact that we saw population growth exceed all limits and break all barriers and go completely out of control. You had immediately after the pandemic, say 2022, you had population growth of 600,000 people. Now, in order to get that same level of growth in any other year in Canada, you have to go back to 1949 for the last year in which you saw plus 600,000 growth in a single year. And the reason why we had that in 1949 was because Newfoundland joined Confederation in that year. So that was not actually immigration. That was just because we had an entirely new province. The following year, 2023, we saw immigration drive a population growth rate of nearly 1.3 million, nearly 1.3 million. And so this obviously had effects stretching through the healthcare system, housing, social services, classrooms, infrastructure, transit. It washed through all of our systems, everything from food banks to the capacity for municipalities to meet the demands of their citizens. And you finally saw what's long been called Canada's immigration consensus completely shatter. And yeah, it was shattered, and I think very rightly so.
Well, that's quite a summation, and we're going to go where no one dares to go, and that is, we're gonna look at this, very carefully in terms of the facts and research, and I wanna bring up 2 very interesting graphs, because, obviously, federal policy has literally flooded this country. And here's the facts. I mean, this is, compiled this graph is courtesy of the Fraser Institute, our friends there, and this is all based on Stats Canada information. But you can see this massive increase that I think this powerfully illustrates visually what you're talking about, Riley, doesn't it?
It does, and what you can see there is that you see Trudeau's election in 2015, and you see an immediate spike, particularly in non-permanent immigration, and this was a kind of immigration that historically Canada had very little of. Historically, our approach has been to take permanent residents. And so permanent residents are people who are on track to become citizens, full citizens in Canada who will hopefully begin to integrate into the labor force, into the economy, and also into our social structure. But what you saw here immediately after 2015 and then especially after 2020 was this dramatic growth in international students, foreign workers, and asylum seekers. And much of this, I would say, was attributable to the intense lobbying of the Trudeau government beginning in 2015, picking up during and after the pandemic on the part of the business lobby that saw these international students and foreign workers as sources of cheap labor.
Interesting. And this doesn't even include, the category of illegal immigrants either. This is just who we know of, so that's another topic, a very important footnote. So if we look at the next slide, because 'cause we're not just looking at this in kind of a, more recent perspective, we're looking at a strategic long research here, and we look at this from 1852 to 2020. So we've got a lot of ups and downs here, Riley. Help us explain what this is all about.
Well, look, so what we're told, one of these myths of immigration is that historically we have had an average of 1% in terms of immigration every year. And so, what the Carney government currently is taking that to mean is that we should have permanent resident levels set at 1%. And so 1% of the population that is. And so that's why they've set it a little bit lower at 380,000 per year, but roughly speaking, that's about 1% of our total population. And so the reason they tell us is that Canada has always had an average of 1% per year. But if you actually look at a timeline like this, what you see is right from it starts at a little bit before Confederation, you had very little immigration, and then you see dips and rises. And you see, for example, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, you see this huge spike. And this was particularly because we were trying to settle the Western prairies and so that we could forestall American annexation, essentially. So we wanted to settle these prairies. And we brought in a lot of Eastern Europeans. The immigration minister, Clifford Sifton, at the time called them stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats. And he's and so it was a very intentional periodic burst of immigration. And then you see it stop. And then it's probably the best illustration is in the 1930s during the Great Depression, right in the middle of that graph. You can see that it has essentially dipped to 0 for, for, for about 2 decades there, and then it starts to pick back up, and then it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down, and that has historically been our approach. It's long been colloquially referred to as the tap on, tap off approach. So we turn the tap
Interesting
on.
that
Yeah.
you called it the tap on, the tap off approach to
Yes.
immigration. And what drove that decision to turn on the tap versus turning it off?
Well, look, so at the very towards the right hand of the graph, you see in the year 1990, that's when the tap on, tap off approaches ended. And you see
Ah,
this permanent wall of immigration after that. And at the very, very far right, you see this massive spike, and that's the post pandemic population boom. But really, you can see from 1990 to 2026 that the tap on, tap off approach has been ended. And it was the Mulroney government at the time and they made the intentional policy decision of departing from that norm. He was the first prime minister to raise immigration during a recession. So historically, we had always just modified it based on domestic economic factors. And so he was the first to say, okay, we're going to have this permanent high annual intake. And every single prime minister since then, conservative and liberal, has continued that policy.
okay, so to be clear, we're looking at the strategic larger picture here, going back a long time, and, you can see then that 1990 was a significant departure from the historical norms around immigration, where there was a so-called tap on, tap off approach and a constant kind of throttling up of immigration. And then all of a sudden in 2015, it went on steroids. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's an entirely fair summary.
So here we are, and it is really quite a remarkable place to be because I think that your wording before was really quite significant. Is that there was a kind of a consensus on immigration in Canada, the belief that, I've seen the polls going back decades, where historically the support for Canadians for immigration was well over 50%, and now that's flipped. Um, and that's really what in your mind has really driven that flip of opinion where most Canadians now don't see immigration as a plus?
Generally, Canadians will trust that the immigration system is acting to the best benefit of the nation if they feel that it is under control. I think control is the key word in terms of Canadian public opinion on immigration. Whenever the public senses that it has lost control of the policy and that control of the policy has been relegated to special interest groups who have their own private financial or political reasons for increasing immigration, that is when the public tends to have this outpouring of criticism, and you've seen that in different, times in the last few decades, but it's especially pronounced now, and I think in large part, it's this sense that the business lobby within Canada has been using our immigration system to solve their own, labor woes, essentially.
Mm, mhm. Okay, so that's very interesting. We wanna, with your kind help, Riley, understand some basic categories around immigration because it is complex. Help us understand what are the basic categories and, understand the definition around them.
Sure. Well, you have permanent residents. That's probably the one that people are most familiar with, and these are people who some are economic. About 60% are technically under the economic class. There's a bit of fine grain detail that you can go into there, but essentially that's the majority of it. But then you also have substantial family reunification. Yeah, it's about 20%, which are family reunification, and it's important to note that these are not just spouses or children. I saw a story a while ago that said there was this one family, I believe in Manitoba, that was just celebrating the arrival of the 150th family member. So what's that? That's called chain migration. So one person brings in a brother, someone brings in their brother, someone brings in parents, grandparents, children, cousins. So that's family reunification. That's not an insubstantial portion. And then you have a slightly smaller portion. I think it's about 15%, which are under the humanitarian category. So that would be
Mhm,
refugees. Some of those are government sponsored refugees, some are sponsored by private groups, such as churches,
mhm,
and some are not strictly speaking refugees, but they're refugee claimants. So they're asylum seekers who have arrived inside the country and are making a claim on the Canadian immigration system. They're saying, we need protection. And so those are adjudicated, and some become permanent residents and some are rejected. So that's the permanent residents. But I guess it's important to note the non-permanent residents, which, as you mentioned, have become a very substantial percentage of our population, which is a very strange and historically abnormal point to be at. But so these are international students, temporary foreign workers, asylum seekers. If they're still claimants, they're also in the non-permanent resident category. Then a smattering of other groups, but in bulk, it's the students and the workers.
Okay, so that's a helpful summary of the different categories, both permanent and temporary, and of course, persons who come in on humanitarian grounds. I did refer earlier to illegal immigration, and I know it's a hard issue to get a full handle on. And there's been, some research on this, but what is your response? Is there a lot of illegal immigration in Canada?
Yeah, I would say there is. And so it's impossible to know the number, right? By its very nature, it is not possible because all we have are estimates. But the official government estimates, I believe as of 2024, was that it could be as high as 600,000 illegal. 600,000, but that was 2024, and so it's very possible that it could be substantially higher now because after the pandemic, as we discussed, we had this massive flow of students and workers and asylum seekers. So with students and workers, they can't come in on permits, and those permits have expiry deadlines. And so whether that's 2 or 3 years, depending on what stream they're in, it will expire. These are temporary residents, right? And so you had, I think the highest point was in 2024, the non-permanent residents rose to 7.5% of the total population of Canada. And so that was about 3 million people. Now, some will certainly go back, once their permit expires, and some will not. And we know this because, for example, in Surrey's extortion crisis at the moment, a lot of the people that are being rounded up, in fact, entire groups of them, sometimes they round up 8 or 9 or 10 people at once. Sometimes all of them are on student permits or expired student permits.
No kidding. Now, maybe you could just explain there, because that's quite a headline. Is the nature of these extortion types of crimes that's going on, not only in the lower mainland in BC, but in other parts of the country, including in Brampton? Help explain what that's about.
Well, sure. I mean, so these are enclaves. These are ethnic enclaves that have grown up, and that's not to castigate residents of them, but this is just an accurate demographic description of places like Brampton or Surrey, and so they have substantial Indian populations there, and some are fairly long-standing, decades old populations, and a lot are very very recent, and so the kind of tragic thing that's happening there is that these Indian business owners, homeowners are being very viciously targeted by these extortionists, and these are violent extortions. This is not even like the Italian mob or something like that, where these are fire bombings. People are pulling up, and groups of people are shooting into residences, shooting at businesses overnight, and so they're asking for these just absurd sums, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, it's horrible. This is happening in the thousands, and these are violent shakedowns of businesses, people who are hardworking, and these thugs are demanding significant amounts of money. It's outrageous, and there's been very few arrests.
Yeah, there have been very few arrests, and there was even one situation where a number of people were arrested. A number of these gangsters were arrested, and then they all claimed asylum.
W
uh, they,
They all
yeah,
claimed asylum.
they all claimed asylum, and so presumably those claims will be rejected, and the Carney government is undergoing some asylum reforms that we can speak about. But that just kind of shows the preposterous nature of what's going on.
But Riley, this is not a small matter. This is impacting people's lives, their families, incredible anxiety and frustration. And meanwhile, we all know that Canada is legendary for having slow-moving processes regarding refugee asylum, where there's cases where I know these famous cases where people literally appealed their refugee status dozens and dozens of times and successfully. And this has cost the taxpayer millions. And this is I'm not sure if it's common knowledge, but it's certainly a reality of our system. So in that context, I mean, I think everyone I can see people rolling their collective eyes and saying, how is it that a so-called rational country like Canada is putting in place these kinds of administrative policies that enable the bad guys to walk all over us and take advantage of our generosity? isn't that the problem that's undermining the fundamental trust in our immigration system?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that so you can look at some of the reforms that have been undertaken by the Carney government. To their credit, they have put in Bill C-12 that has put a 1 year cap, a 1 year limit on asylum claims. So after you are physically in the country for 1 year, you can no longer claim asylum. All you can have is something called a pre-removal risk assessment, which is likely to be denied, and you will then be hopefully deported from the country. But so they have, to their credit, done limited reforms like that. But the fundamental problem is that we are offering such enormous pull factors to these asylum seekers. We spend, I believe, about over $1 billion a year on healthcare. And as was for asylum seekers specifically, and as was noted by Polyev recently, a lot of this is supplemental healthcare, things like physiotherapy, that Canadians do not get for free, but asylum seekers are provided out of the taxpayer's pocket. But not only that, also there's housing. There was a housing program, federal housing program for asylum seekers that was about another $1 billion for housing. And they get other financial benefits, they get stipends. And beyond that, they I think what is not discussed is that they also get the offer of permanent residency, which is w we view that as, like, automatic. "Oh, okay, of course, we should if an asylum seeker is approved, they should get permanent residency. Why not? We're a compassionate country." But other countries are starting to actually take a very different approach, namely Denmark and the UK are two countries recently that have both, first Denmark and later on the UK was inspired by their example, both under left wing governments, by the way. Denmark, in particular, being kind of a progressive haven, very much admired. Everyone bicycles. They have a extensive welfare state and all that. But what they said was, asylum seekers from now on will be temporary. We will give them temporary haven. And once the situation in their home countries is resolved, they will be sent back. And so, for example, they declared Syria as a safe country after the conflict had subsided. And they told this Syrian asylum seeker population in Denmark, we have offered you asylum, and now is the time to leave because they have recognized that there is no reason to offer someone the chance to become a citizen just because they're an asylum seeker. The UK recently did a very similar reform. And so I think that's the fundamental problem is that we have all these pull factors that are bringing in people, and we now have around 300,000 asylum claimants in Canada.
300,000 that are in limbo right now.
Yeah, so I mean, imagine a town or a city of 300,000. That's a huge number of people.
And just to clarify, so there's, I mean, hundreds of details here, to put it lightly, but the changes in processes when it comes to processing these kinds of applications across all categories has changed remarkably. Um, so a lot of this just happens online. Like as you want to claim asylum, you could be anywhere and you can just do the application online and then show up. Is that really the essence of it?
Well, you have to be physically present on Canadian soil. But the issue with that is that you can, and they're starting to address this aspect, but you can cross illegally from the United States and then you're physically present. Another way is you can fly in on a visitor visa. We give these really generous visitor visas, I think about 6 months, which causes a lot of problems for us administratively. But so you can be on a visitor visa, you can be a temporary resident. You can come here as an international student even with the 1 year cap that we now have. Say you're here for 3 months, 8 months as an international student, then you can claim asylum. You can be a foreign worker and claim asylum. These are all things that could be reformed.
I mean, it's kind of stunning. And I think, a fair number of Canadians are aware of this and they see it around them. So This is where it gets into kind of a, how is it that we can't ground this policy in common sense? I mean, it seems like, people want to be obviously compassionate and caring, but this sounds to the point of being flipped on its head that Canadians are being taken advantage of left, right, and center. So we know that there's been a reaction now to these extraordinarily high levels of categories of immigration across the board. And already with the Trudeau government and now the Carney government, there's been changes. Can you help us understand how those changes are being made and what would be the summary there?
Sure. So under Trudeau, you had a very obstinate refusal for several years, even after the post pandemic population boom, to do anything about it. And you do have ministers that were ministers then that are still ministers now, like Mark Miller, that were very, very emphatic that there was no link between immigration and housing, that to even suggest that would border on xenophobia. And so eventually, in 2024, so after 2 consecutive years, or you could even say 3 consecutive years if you include 2024, a very, very heavy population growth, eventually you do see the Trudeau government backtracking. And this really, dramatic U-turn where essentially they said, "Look, we have made a mistake. Population growth has been far too high, and we are now going to slam down these caps on international students, foreign workers, and they stabilized permanent resident admissions, and subsequently cut them by about 21%. And I mean, it's worth noting that before then, we actually didn't have caps on temporary resident streams, which is kind of astonishing. And I don't think people
There were no caps on temporary.
there were no caps. Yeah, there were no caps on things like students or foreign workers. And so subsequently to this, now those 2 streams are always included in our annual immigration levels plan because now
Mhm.
there are caps. But
Right.
then you have the incoming Carney government, 2025, and the Carney government did cut back temporary resident admissions by about 300,000. So that's temporary residents specifically. And they have so that's still the admissions will still stand at something like another 300,000. So I believe they cut them from roughly 600 to 300, roughly speaking. And then they also they have a stable permanent resident admissions target of 380,000, which is very, very high, but is still lower than at one point the Trudeau government was planning to increase it to 500,000. And the other notable thing about the Carney government is Bill C-12, which is the reforms to the asylum program, which I mentioned earlier. And another element of that is that it allows cabinet to cancel or suspend immigration documents of different kinds. So it essentially gives them more oversight, a little bit more control. Um, so you do have those reforms, but at the same time, I would emphasize that fundamentally the outlook is still the same. What Carney is trying to do is not he's not an immigration restrictionist. He's not someone who is trying to significantly lower the numbers over time. He is recognizing that the Canadian public is so hostile towards high immigration levels now, that he needs to undertake certain reforms in order to possibly resurrect that old immigration consensus, which I think will be very difficult for him to do.
Okay, so that's quite a summary. There's certainly lots of changes that are happening to moderate the numbers, but they're still relatively high, you could argue. And, obviously in this area of policy, you have to work with public opinion so you don't lose support if I'm hearing you, Riley. So in this case, I want to just step back for a moment and reflect a little bit about the kind of impacts that high immigration has had, or the management of those files had on the Canadian public. And I think there's some really significant historical markers. And I want to give you one example. One would be the tragedy that happened a number of years ago in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, where we had an extraordinary number of high temporary workers come in the whole job classification of truck drivers. And that is another set of, well, details around that, but there's this consistent pattern, and you can see report after this that shows that there are concerns about safety, the training of people coming in. And do you think tragedies like that have really solidified in Canadians' minds that maybe we've really opened the door up too wide? Was that a significant marker in Canadian history?
It was, absolutely. It was a truly tragic event, and it's not the only one of its kind because you see these trucking disasters happen all the time. You have people that are brought in from India that have no experience driving on Canadian winter roads. And it just boggles the mind as to why a government would be bringing in people and not requiring significant degree of training for these incredibly dangerous occupations. But I think it goes beyond that, and people start asking themselves the question, "Why do we need foreign truckers?" Are there no Canadian truckers? Why do we need to bring in people for these kinds of occupations? We only started bringing in, for example, the temporary foreign worker program was first put in place in the 70s. So it was after 100 years after Confederation, we had done without the temporary foreign worker program. It was put in place in the 70s. The low skill portion was only added in the early 2000s, relatively recent in the broad scope of things. And since then, there have been these entire industries that have built up that are just highly concentrated with foreign workers. Not only things like trucking, but also fast food. It was billed initially as in the 60s, you had the seasonal agricultural worker program, which is specifically for agriculture. But after that, it spiraled out of control, and it has now everything, the famous example, of course, is Tim Hortons. Everything from Tim Hortons to McDonald's to your local shopping mall to hotel resorts to trucking. Everything, as a result of intensive lobbying from certain elements of the business lobby, everything has been suffused with these high concentrations of foreign workers.
Indeed, and it's very visible in the community, and I'm wondering then, in all due respect to, those businesses, there's a frustration. I mean, I hear it, say in the agricultural community and different industries, that so many Canadians don't wanna do this kind of work. And of course, there's a debate going on here. How do you get, everyone working? I mean, there's all kinds of people that are unemployed or underemployed, to put it politely. I mean, I grew up working on farms, all the time, and, I had a very positive experience, but, what's your response to that? Like, how do you, well, have a kind of the right balance of people coming into the country, while also trying to incentivize changes, whether it's through higher wages or automation? There's all kinds of solutions to walk the line from a policy point of view so that we don't have, well, high youth unemployment, which is a real problem in this country. Is there any insight there, Riley, you would offer?
Yeah, I think the issue is that it's sort of a chicken and the egg situation. If we didn't have the temporary foreign worker program, then young people would be doing these jobs. And I can say that with certainty because look, you have roughly 7% total unemployment at the moment. And that's kind of underestimated because, it doesn't include people who've given up looking and things like that. So it's probably a lot higher. And then youth unemployment is 14%. And so that's the statistical angle, but then you also have these really powerful anecdotes where you keep seeing these videos that are circulating online. The most recent being 5,000 young people in Calgary showed up in this job fair. So there's this 5,
5,000.
and so these are people like one young guy was saying to the reporter that was interviewing them, "Look, I've applied for 100 jobs and I haven't even heard back from one." These are people that would actually be very glad for a summer or even for part-time during university to take a job at a Tim Hortons, to take a job at a local shopping mall, something like that. And so I don't think it's that people are not willing to work. I think it's that this business lobby has successfully convinced the federal and to some degree the provincial governments that they need these high concentrations of foreign workers. And what they say is it's because of a labor shortage. But so I would say that the unemployment figures alone disprove the idea that there is any general labor shortage. But they may be correct that in certain specific sectors, there's very specific labor shortages, but in those cases, there is not just one answer. You don't have to bring in foreign workers because there's a sector-specific labor shortage. Um, doing that, undergoing that solution actually disincentivizes the businesses from doing what they should be doing, which is training people, offering incentives, raising their wages in certain cases, and so this constant inflow of cheap labor actually does drag down productivity because it encourages these businesses to have this low skill, low wage model instead of innovating. Um, and you do talk about agriculture. There may be a case for the seasonal agricultural worker program, but remember that that was from the 60s. The temporary foreign worker program as a whole in terms of high and low skill jobs. That began in the 70s and then the early 2000s. So you could quite successfully make a case for abolishing the low wage and the high wage temporary foreign worker streams and keeping the seasonal agricultural worker program. But I would even say with that, we should be careful to just assume that no Canadians will ever do these jobs if we gave them the opportunity. In the 60s, and even later in Vancouver, they had these programs where they would bring teenagers from one part of Vancouver on these trucks out into the agricultural areas in Richmond and Surrey and so on, to be strawberry pickers during the summer. I'm not saying that this would solve all problems. I'm just saying that we are a little bit hasty in assuming that labor shortages can only ever be solved with foreign labor.
Yeah, no, I like the way you're challenging us to think a little bit outside the box here, and with a view to try to make a priority of hiring Canadians. I mean, if we look at trying to nurture the next generation to be able to address Canada's significant productivity crisis, surely part of that answer is to increase the employment participation by all age categories, including young people. So that sounds good to me. Um, it is remarkable that it is so easy as, say, a retail business to go if you're hiring a lot of people to basically outsource your HR function to foreign companies who will gladly, recruit and do the basic training, and then, presto, you've got a workforce and you don't have to worry about it. So I think this is a very concerning matter. And I think Canadians are certainly picked up on it. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have in our immigration system. The other seminal thing that I have remember very well is the recent Auditor General's report that royally, I don't know what to say, critiqued our immigration system as a problem. Can you give us the summary on the Auditor General's report? Because it was pretty damning.
Well, sure. So essentially, they took a sample of potential fraud cases in the international student program, and they found that just a minuscule percentage were actually being followed up on. So I think they took about 150,000. They found that several thousand were being even looked into at all, but they found that within that small number, that a significant percentage of that was those investigations were suspended after the people stopped responding to their emails. So, in other words, they were investigating, quote unquote, these potential fraud situations, which could be people who are simply not attending, people who are working when they're not supposed to be working, who are violating the conditions of their permanent of their temporary resident visa. And so in some cases, they simply stopped investigating them once they stopped contacting them. And I mean, it's very interesting. Like you would never imagine that happening with the CRA. If I ever have the misfortune of being audited by the CRA, then I can say for sure that if I just stop responding to their emails, they will certainly not suspend that investigation. They do not have that same attitude towards Canadian citizens. Um, I think it's interesting because they say, "Well, look, we don't have, enough resources to investigate these cases of fraud." But, you know, you it
But just to hold on for a sec there because that's a key headline. The Auditor General's budget was throttled back, so they actually did not have the resources to undertake investigations on a scale sufficient to actually give you a statistical credible answer on the degree of fraud happening in the system. I mean, this is you can't make this up. This is like out of a bad movie, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, I wonder about the idea that they don't have the resources. For one, if you truly don't have the resources, then obviously the answer would be to cut the total number of visas that you're allocating until it reaches such a number that you do have the resources to investigate fraud. But I do wonder about the reality of this idea that they don't have enough funds because I saw in the most recent immigration levels plan by the Carney government that they are allocating, I believe, $1.7 billion towards what they call a suite of recruitment measures towards as academics, like foreign academics, assistant
Yeah, high skilled
professors.
occupations, right?
Yeah, supposedly high skill occupations, but I mean, if you ask the typical Canadian, do you think it's worth it to spend nearly $2 billion to recruit professors? I think they would probably say, "Look, I think we already have enough." Or they would say, "Well, can't we hire Canadian professors?" I mean, it really is laughable. And imagine if they devoted that same foreign recruitment budget to combating fraud, right?
Right, exactly. But the punchline is that the Auditor General's report was pretty damning. And this goes back to your overriding solution or what do you say, safety cord here. And that is to turn off the tap, to really ratchet down the system until we get control of it. Otherwise, we'll get more of the same. Is that one response, Riley?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Turning down the tap, that is the response that we traditionally used throughout Canadian history from Confederation until the early 90s when the domestic conditions were tough in terms of the economy. We turned off the tap. And in certain precise periods when we felt that we needed immigration for specific reasons, we turned it back on and then we turned it back off again. And I do think that there is a strong case for turning it off now, and I think leaving it off for a number of years. Because if you think about it, all of our systems in our society have been so totally overwhelmed by the post pandemic immigration boom. Everything from hospitals to housing to social services. And we do need time to catch up, and we do need to reevaluate the purpose of our immigration system. Why do we have this idea that we need a high, permanent, annual inflow of immigration? I would advocate for returning to the tap off approach that prevailed until the 90s.
Okay, so that's a very significant insight. And I'm wondering when it comes to the rationale of this, well, high immigration platform, as you've helped us understand better, it's often been said that one of the rationales for high immigration is, well, demographics. Our fertility rate in Canada, the last time I checked, is what is it, 1.121, and dropping. I mean, when the replacement rate for per child is 2.1, we have a real problem in this country, a real challenge. So, is immigration the answer to our demographic woes?
No, no, it's not. And look, so we're told that there's a number of immigration myths that we are told, and one of them is this idea of the aging society. We need high permanent levels of immigration because of the aging society. Well, this has been evaluated. There was a 2004, I believe, paper by the C.D. Howe Institute that was called "No Elixir for Youth," and it looked at it, this idea of immigration as a solution for aging, and it said, "No, you cannot use immigration to solve aging because there's immigrants have this very unfortunate habit of aging themselves and retiring like everyone, and so it does turn into this Ponzi scheme where you have to add more and more people every year. And that was the conclusion of a different paper that was just released last year by the Migration Policy Institute. And they concluded that the only way to actually use immigration to solve aging would be if you permanently and indefinitely increased it over and over again every year ad infinitum. And because, I mean, you bring in immigrants and eventually their fertility rates will come to resemble our domestic fertility rates. They enter into an industrialized, wealthy country, right? And so it's not an actual solution. And furthermore, I think it papers over, or we use it as an excuse not to address the fertility rates themselves. And in one final bit of irony is that it's very possible and likely that the high immigration that we have sustained for during the Trudeau years, and for the last several decades may actually be significantly dragging down our domestic fertility rate. Because if you think about it, one of the factors behind choosing to have a kid or several kids or how many kids you have is, do you have suitable housing? Right? And so you do have some people just simply don't want kids, and that's their choice, but you have a substantial percentage in different polls of young Canadians that are asked if they want children, and some say, "Yeah, I would like children, I'd like 1 or 2 or 3 kids, but I'm living in a shoebox, apartment in Toronto, and I have no hope of owning a single family home."
Mhm.
Um
Exactly. Yeah, let alone getting a suitably paid job that, you would feel you'd be in a position to have a family. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, so I think that's very well said. I mean, mathematically, it's not immigration is not the solution, as you're saying, to our demographic challenges, so we really need to take a hard look and get deeper on those issues, that's for sure. Um, the other side to this has been, I think, the challenge of our productivity in this country, and I think that the classifications or the definitions around immigration are also telling another story. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand how so many immigrants coming to this country may have viable skills, but increasingly many do not. And I'm concerned that, the immigration system, we talk a lot about it serving Canadians, but quite frankly, does this immigration system as we have now actually not serve many of the people coming into the country where they can't find suitable employment or relatively low skilled, and we're creating a whole underclass of people, many of which come in and are indentured or they are in high debt that they have to in turn pay back to these employers. Does that concern you that we're creating this whole underclass of people?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, Canadians are told that we have this points system, right? We're always told that we have
Mhm.
a point system. We do have a point system that applies to some categories of our immigration. It does not apply to all of them. Even if you look at permanent residents, and you take the 20% or so that are family reunification, they are exempt from the point system. They simply have a right to come here because we are affording their family members here the right to bring them over. So they are exempt from the point system. Refugees and asylum claimants and so on are also exempt from the point system. And then you have the massive proportion of the population that is now non-permanent residents, students, and workers. And these people are not brought in under the point system. They are simply applying, match in the case of foreign workers, they're matched up with an employer. And these people are often very low skill. Sometimes they're cooks in restaurants, but sometimes they're busboys. Sometimes they're working at retail locations. And so we're told that we have this really, selective system that's searching out the best and brightest. But what's really happening is that businesses here have the incentive to bring in large amounts of low skill labor. And so I guess in terms of the international student program, it's very important to note that, why were all of these people coming in? Like, why were all these students coming in after the pandemic? Was it because they really wanted to study in our amazing institutions in Canada? No, in fact, the very important thing to note about them is that they can work for 24 hours a week while they're here. And these people are generally not working in high skill occupations. They're generally working for minimum wage jobs. And after they graduate, they're given a postgraduate work permit. So they can stay for another several years
Ah.
as likely a low skill worker.
So this goes back to your statement about creating incentives for people to really come here and eventually stay for years, and then will never leave.
Well, yeah, and in terms of the student program specifically, because this is such a large source of labor now, which it was not intended to be, but it has become. Um, what we should understand is that while they're here on their study visa and while they're on their postgraduate work permit, all that time they can count that towards the physical residency requirement for permanent residence. Right? And so that was removed by the Harper government, the fiscal residency, the ability to count their time towards that, and then by the Trudeau government, they restored that. And so you have both the work as a pull factor, but also eventually permanent residency. And this speaks to what you're saying, is that really it's skewing the total admissions towards low skill, low wage occupation.
Right. And I think you point out well that so much of our immigration system now is not subject to the point system. And in that regard, I have noticed within the regulatory regime now that you could argue that's been politicized as they steadily have increased the acceptable age and also the number of health conditions that are allowed, thereby putting much greater strain on our social services as well as our healthcare system. Is that a fair comment, Riley?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, even beyond that, we have the parent and grandparent family reunification stream and so that one is currently paused, but it's not paused with the aim of ending it. It's paused because there's such a massive inflow of applications for that stream that they had to pause it because there's such a huge backlog.
And this is entirely unusual when it comes to the history of immigration in this country. Is that not correct?
Yeah, it is unusual. Yeah, and I think historically the goal of immigration, you could say for the '60s, early '60s was when the Diefenbaker government introduced the point system. Um, but from then on, it slowly just started to get more and more perverted and corrupted as more and more and more programs were added. So, like in the late '70s, you had the family reunification added, and then, as I was saying earlier, you had different wage streams for the temporary foreign workers added. You had this massive growth in the international student program. So a smaller and smaller proportion of our total immigrants are actually accepted for their unique skills and attributes.
So that is the reality. Another very important dimension here that is worth discussing and referencing, and I know there's so many angles to this in report after report. I mean, the research is stunning, is the lack of concern that the federal government has had for security. We see this in case after case where, well, there's a recent article by retired judge at Frontier, Judge Brian Giesbrecht, who refers to, well, just one part of the population. And I know that report after report shows there's some 50 um, criminal and terrorist syndicates in Canada. I mean, it's hard to believe this,
Yeah.
but there's an article that was done by, Brian Giesbrecht that says Canada must stop being a safe haven for Iran's enforcers, and this is based on a tragedy where back on March the 6th of this year, the body of a mathematics professor at, the Simon Fraser University was found, and he was killed by, Iranian operatives tied to that regime, and, this is in the context of a report that confirms over 700 Iranian operatives in this country. I mean, this is one of many, many cases, and this is really kind of concerning. Is there any efforts now by this government to start changing the policies by which we do criminal screening? It seems like a lot of bad guys are finding haven here in this country.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's entirely accurate, and it's not only things like terrorist syndicates and organized crime, which is disturbing enough, but also even just things like petty crime. Like you have there's this brutal double homicide of this elderly couple in Abbotsford, and you had at least one of the assailants was on a study visa, and so clearly, this is not the only case. You also had in Surrey the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the Sikh separatist leader. And those are also people who came in on study and work permits. And so when you have this vast yearly allotment of temporary resident permits, students and workers, of course, criminal elements will slip in. And you've seen this for a long time. It has also abetted the rise of organized gang crime in Vancouver. Certain Chinese syndicates like the
Mhm,
Triads. You've seen
mhm.
that for decades.
Well, right across this country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And um, I don't see that there is a strong emphasis in this current government to address this problem. And you even had this immigration official not too long ago. I remember him. He was being interviewed in one of these committees, parliamentary committees, and he was saying at the end of the day, what you have for a lot of refugees in terms of criminal screening is an honor system.
I guess that is very practical because if you call another country up, the country of origin of someone coming into Canada, who do you know who you're really talking to? What's the verification system that your data or information regarding that individual is even based on any reality?
Well, I mean, absolutely, and you see this with a lot of asylum claims in particular. These you don't necessarily know what their motivations are. You have a very large percentage that are claiming that they are in the LGBT community. You have a very large percentage that are claiming that. Are all of them? It's a very hard to say, and you have another significant amount that say, "Well, I'm being targeted by organized gangs in my home country." Very
Now, just hold on for a sec. So, in other words, and to be clear, this is in the new legislation for what is termed as acceptable claims for amnesty is now based on the current redefinition of policies of groups that consider themselves to be victims, like in those categories that you just referred to. Is that right?
Well, right, and I mean, the tough thing is that and the other thing is what I'm getting at is that you often see, a whole bunch of asylum claims that are all worded in a very, very similar way to each other, which means that likely they have been coached or provided with a document by some kind of unscrupulous consultant or lawyer, and perhaps even an unlicensed consultant, which is not a real consultant. We have 12,000 licensed consultants, and then you have this kind of shadow industry of fake consultants that provide this kind of advice. And so what they probably seem to be saying to a lot of these people is, you can slip into Canada if you say this, this, or this. Just say X, Y, or Z. You can say that you're LGBT. You can say that you're targeted by organized crime. And so these are very hard things to verify on our end, right? And so I mean you really can't have an honor system for something like immigration.
And it's all online.
Yeah, and I mean, I was told yesterday. I was talking to this immigration consultant for this piece that I'm writing, and she was telling me that it's so online now that what you can it actually do if you're trying to become a full citizen is you can apply online, but you will even get your citizenship document emailed to you as an attachment, you know? So like it's really we have this image, I think the general Canadian image is that, oh, okay, we have these citizenship ceremonies. All these people are in a room, they're singing "Oh Canada." Now and then that does happen, and I think a lot of the time it happens is for these photo ops for the immigration minister to come in, and they're there, and everyone's smiling, and they're given the little Canadian flags. But really, I mean, a lot of this stuff has been transferred online. Another thing is for the citizenship test. That is online, and what it is an online multiple choice quiz, which I believe you have 3 attempts to complete. Which, you know, which is just it's really, really baffling to think about this cheapening of our citizenship, which is really such a valuable thing.
Well, it certainly does underline a lot of concerns that we're not really taking the citizenship process seriously, and I know that there's a lot of debate now about that new citizenship test, especially if you can do it 3 times. Um,
Right.
and on a related note here, I'm curious, the, take on Bill C-3. I have taken the time to read it, and I am just kind of amazed by what this bill will do. It sounds like this is an introduction of the broadening of citizenship to be multi-generational. I mean, this is almost like from I would never have believed it. Like, help us understand what Bill C-3 is about.
Yeah, Bill C-3 is very strange. Essentially, you had a situation where previously we had a generational limit on citizenship. So if you're a Canadian citizen and you're abroad for a period of time and then you have a baby, then that child is a citizen, but it doesn't keep carrying forward. So when that child grows up and they have a baby and then that baby grows up, it doesn't just keep carrying forward. But what
Yeah, you
happens?
don't inherit citizenship.
Yeah, you inherit it, but only for a very specific generational time
Yeah.
period. You don't. It's not just unlimited. Um, if you're outside the country, that is. But what happened was the Ontario Superior Court ruled that this was unconstitutional, which is a very, very strange ruling. And the federal government could have appealed that, of course. That was fully within their choice. They did not.
But they didn't.
They did not. They did not. And they passed C3, which was first introduced under the Trudeau government and then passed under the Carney government. And so what it does is that it seems to have eliminated all generational limits on citizenship. And so what you have is, particularly in the United States, you have this massive percentage of the population that is descended from French Canadians, for example. So in New England, I saw an article recently that says that probably 1 in 4 New Englanders are secret Canadians because they have a French Canadian far, far back in their family tree. And there's even this list of 42 specific last names that is being circulated around. So names like Rivers was probably an anglicization of Rivière, or Stone was probably a translation from La Pierre. And so all of these people have no actual connection to Canada. They may have never been here, but church archives and other repositories of birth certificates and baptismal records are being inundated with requests for documents from these people. And so there's because then they get access to some ancient birth certificate from the 1800s. Oh, my great 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 grandfather was a French Canadian, or he lived in Toronto. And so then they send that in to the Canadian government, and the Canadian government is approving these citizenships for people who may have never been in Canada and who never actually went through an immigration process.
Just remarkable. I mean, it strikes me that we've gone through, I mean, no immigration system is perfect, but it sounds like Canada has thrown the doors open to kind of a de facto open border system, not only in terms of numbers, and I know it's ratcheting down to some degree, but then we've got all these escape hatches that keep the door open so that you've got, well, intergenerational citizenship, and you've got a kind of an amnesty now for potentially millions of people that are temporary. so they can end up staying here anyways. I mean, Riley, it seems like we don't have this system under control or it's serving someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there is no general amnesty that is proposed for the temporary residents who are numbering potentially. I believe the latest number was 2.6 million. These are people who are on our soil. But what the worry there is that there's so much pressure from certain lobby organizations, including, for example, the World Sikh Organization is one of these prominent lobbies that is advocating for for permit extensions, and another lobby for that is organizations like the Migrant Rights Network or CUPE, which is a public sector union, which is astonishing that a union claiming to represent Canadian workers would be advocating for things like permit extensions, but that is happening. And so the worry is that there is this intensive lobbying for these millions of temporary residents that are still on our soil and that should be headed home this year or next year as their visas expire. There is this lobbying for them to remain. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to really remain vigilant about is that our political elite does not implement any kind of amnesty for people who should lawfully be headed home. Under the Trudeau government, in 2024, there was a proposal for such an amnesty. Mark Miller was spearheading that proposal. It ended up being shot down by the Trudeau cabinet because it was too radical even for them.
So as we look at this kind of challenging situation regarding this immigration, this policy file, it's not a surprise that the provinces are weighing in because as the federal government's opened the door, all those additional people end up incredible costs are downloaded on the healthcare system, education, every aspect of our lives. And I want to share this clip um, as Daniel Smith speaks to this issue of immigration.
Adding 600,000 people in 5 years is like adding half the city of Calgary or Edmonton in 5 years. Although sustainable immigration has always been an important part of our provincial growth model, throwing the doors wide open to anyone and everyone across the globe has flooded our classrooms, emergency rooms, and social support systems with far too many people far too quickly. As just one example, our student population has skyrocketed by more than 80,000 students in just the last 4 years, and more than 140,000 students now having English as their additional language. Is it any wonder that our teachers and students are struggling so much?
So that's Daniel Smith's take on the matter here. Are other provinces also trying to take control of, frankly, the immigration file and put limits around it, like including Quebec?
Yes, Quebec is certainly trying to take control, and they're at constant loggerheads with the federal government over how much control. They have a unique Quebec Canada Accord signed in 1990 that affords them mainly they have control over immigration, but it's not total. They want total control, and they want to protect their culture and their language. And I really respect that, and I think that Anglo Canadian premiers should emulate that. And to be honest with you, I haven't seen a lot to be impressed with from most Anglo premiers. You had Tim Houston in Nova Scotia, who had his own miniature version of the Century Initiative, where he wanted to double the population to 2 million. You had even Danielle Smith. I am glad that she is now responding to the concerns of her constituents. But even Danielle Smith, for a time, she was proposing that Alberta's population be doubled to 10 million. Um, so I think that where you really see provincial resistance is particularly in Quebec, where they haven't got the same kind of political correctness norms as the rest of us do.
Okay. So it's interesting that part of the solution here that we're running up to is, well, this constant theme of the federal government um, either interfering in provincial areas or not working cooperatively, like in the field of immigration, to realize the real impacts that throwing the door open has on provincial and local governments and their communities, and this is what astounds, I think, many Canadians, is that they're not really working together as a team. hand in glove to be able to look after the interests of, who's it again? Oh, yeah, Canadians. So, anyways, this is quite a train wreck of a file. And I'm going to ask you as we get to the tail end of our far reaching conversation here is why Canadians should really fundamentally care about this policy area. We know that we can care about it in terms of our costs, we all want immigrants to contribute to this country. We all want to be safe and secure. But fundamentally, why should Canadians care about this immigration policy file?
Well, fundamentally, it is refashioning and changing this country out of recognition. It is changing it to the point that we can no longer recognize it, and people are not willing to say that. But you had under Trudeau his vision of a post-national state with no core identity. Now, Carney does not repeat that explicitly. He talks about civic nationalism, so he has rhetorically shifted away from that. But he does not appear concerned with this fundamental demographic transformation that is occurring in a lot of our cities and towns. Where vast percentages of the population in a very short period of time are becoming foreign born. For instance, he said of Toronto, "Oh, I believe that about 50% of Toronto is foreign born, but you really wouldn't know it if you walked around." Well, I can assure you, you do know it. When you go to these areas of our cities that have become ethnic enclaves in which there is very little to no assimilation, in which English or French is not habitually spoken on the day to day, you do notice and you feel it. And it does not do us a service as Canadians, as native born Canadians, and it does not do foreign born Canadians a service either, because a lot of them, the most honest and hardworking immigrants come here and they are seeing that there is no longer any center in Canadian society. They're seeing that there's nothing left to integrate into. There's nothing left to assimilate into. And worse than that, they're seeing some of the worst elements of their own societies being replicated here. Things like organized crime and corruption, things like honor killings, things like the disputes in Quebec over the Islamic infiltration of certain school boards, right? And so you see these fundamental cultural clashes that are occurring and that are entirely avoidable if we structured our immigration system accordingly. But what you're fundamentally seeing is this dramatic and rapid and unending transformation of our society, which is really threatening our way of life and our values.
Well, I really appreciate your thoughtful analysis and grounding this also both in facts, but also the larger picture of the history of immigration. And I just think, Riley, it's so important that we've had this discussion. And I think that in itself is a very important step in the right direction because your answer to the importance of this file is evident. It's not just simply about our standard of living, but the answer to these questions will fundamentally determine the identity of our country.
Absolutely, it will. And we need to be careful about this because certain changes, once they are done, they cannot be undone. We cannot be treating our citizenship, which is such a valuable and sought after thing throughout the whole entire world. It's one of the most valuable citizenships or passports to have. We should not be treating it like candy and just handing it out like we are currently doing. We should be treating it as a sacred thing, as something that means a lot to us and which is crucial to protect because protecting it means protecting our homeland. We have nowhere else to go, as native born Canadians and as foreign born Canadians who have come here and who love this country. If it is transformed, if these policies that we're undertaking now are continued for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, just imagine how how different this country will be then than it is now.
I agree. Well, it's been great to have this conversation, Riley Donovan, and I want to appreciate you for your leadership as we talk about not only our immigration system, but indeed the identity and the sovereignty of this country.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on, and I'd be happy to do it again.
Thank you so much for watching this recent episode. We love your comments and we'd like to hear more from you. If you haven't, make sure you press this bell and subscribe to this channel. Check everything out. We'd love to hear more about your comments.